From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Westin.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. As we all wait for Jackson Hole, particularly Chair Jay Powell's remarks this Friday, we got some economic data out today, and it was not altogether encouraging. The PMIs, composite for the United States, were down to something like 45. In the meantime, Europe PMIs were also under 50, about 49.2, and new housing sales were the lowest in 6 years for the United States. To give us a sense of where we are in the economy as we head toward Jackson Hole, welcome now Torsten Slok. He's chief economist for Apollo Management. Torsten, great to have you back with us. Always is good to see you. So where is the economy? Is it slowing down as much as some indicators suggest?
Yeah, the data today, as you mentioned, David, was a bit worse than expected. And what was particularly surprising is that the services sector, which has been holding up not only the U.S. economy, but also the European economy, was showing a little bit more sign of weakness. And combining that also with the housing data being a little bit weaker, it is clear that there are some signs, at least now in the services sector, that things are slowing. Housing has been slowing for a while, but it looks like Fed rate hikes, combined, of course, with the situation in Europe on the energy front, are beginning to have at least somewhat of a moderating impact on growth.
So that was going to be my question. Is it too soon to know whether, in fact, the Fed is starting to have the effect that it seeks, which is slowing down the economy some, particularly to get at inflation?
Yeah, that's really important because, I mean, obviously, in the US and Europe, inflation is essentially 8%. And when the target for the ECB and the Fed is 2%, it's very clear that both the ECB and the Fed are trying to get that very high number, 8%, down to 2%. And that does require tighter financial conditions, and that can either come through higher short-term interest rates or higher long-term interest rates, but it can also come through wider credit spreads or lower stock prices. The challenge for the Fed more recently is that stock prices have been going up in the last 4 or 5 weeks. The same thing you also have seen for credit spreads have also been rallying. So in that sense, more may be needed to be done in short rates. But the good news, if you will, from a Fed perspective, is that there are some signs now that the economy is, at least on some fronts, beginning to slow down, and that's exactly the goal that they're trying to achieve.
Of course, one question we all have is how much is it slowing down? Can we, in fact, get inflation down? As you suggested, it's got a long way to come at this point without having a recession. We heard from John Taylor, that famous economist whose rule is named after the rule. We heard from him, actually, and he suggested maybe it is possible to avoid a recession. This is part of what he said.
I don't think it needs to be part of the cure. What we've experienced, if we let inflation build up over time, like in the 70s, it was 7 years of higher and higher inflation. If we nip it in the bud, which I still think we can, then you don't have to have these negative effects that people worried about.
So, Torsten, what is the chance of a so-called soft landing, as John Taylor is suggesting?
Yeah, this is a very important question because this is at the heart of the debate about how much does the Fed need to raise rates? How much demand do they need to destroy in the economy? Well, the answer to that question depends very importantly on why did inflation go up? Did inflation go up because there was more demand? Or did inflation go up because there were some problems with supply in supply chains or labor supply? And a Fed working paper a month or so ago basically quantified that question and found that a third of the rise in inflation was because of demand. And if we therefore are waiting for 2/3 of the problems on the supply side to get resolved, maybe the answer to John Taylor's question here is that we could actually have a soft landing if it is the case that a lot of the problems that we had on the supply side are going to resolve themselves. If supply chain issues are getting better, which they certainly are at the moment, transportation costs are coming down everywhere. So both on truck costs by airplane, by truck, by container, by rail. If that's the case, we could actually have a soft landing if it is the case that these inflation problems solve themselves on their own. If that's the case, all we need is time to resolve those issues on the supply side. And then maybe the demand destruction that's required is not as significant as it was in the 1970s. So it's a very important debate, which also surrounds this question, namely, well, how are the drivers of inflation, how are they quantified in terms of was it demand, was it supply? And if it was really mainly supply, which there's some, at least Fed working papers suggesting, maybe we could have that soft landing that the FOMC members keep on saying is their goal.
All of which takes us to Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, what he has to say on Friday, because it strikes me it's complicated enough. And what you just said, Torsten, I interpret as saying 2/3 of the problem is outside his control, and yet everybody is waiting for him to solve the problem.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly why it's so striking, that Fed paper that was written, namely that maybe if it really is just the fact that we're waiting for supply chain problems to get resolved, well, then all that's needed for the Fed is time. And if that's the case, well, then in some sense, it doesn't really matter that much how much the Fed funds rate goes up. All we need is that we need to get semiconductors out in cars. We need to get containers from the rest of the world into the US and into Europe. We need to get the supply chains back up and running to the pre-pandemic levels. And if that's all we're waiting for, then maybe the Fed funds rate doesn't need to go up as much as at least some observers are saying, at least those who seem to put a lot of weight on saying, oh, inflation is only driven by demand. So that's why this debate, I know it's a bit complex overall in quantifying this, and that's why this is such a challenge for markets at the moment. But the bottom line is that on Friday, I still think the Fed will focus on saying, we don't really completely, meaning the market, anyone really doesn't understand at this point how quickly inflation will come down. But we do know that inflation at more than 8% is a problem. So if that's the case, they need to continue to be hawkish to signal that inflation needs to come down.
If the economy needs time, the markets are not known for their patience in general. And as you've pointed out, actually, the next FOMC meeting is not until September 21st, which is almost an eon from now, as a practical matter. How does that work out? Because there's a lot of data that will come in between now and September 21st. Can the markets wait?
Absolutely. That's why it's also tricky for the Fed on Friday. I mean, what do you communicate when you still have 4 weeks until the next meeting and you don't know what the next employment report will say? You don't know what the next CPI inflation print will say. The latest employment report, of course, had more than 500,000 jobs created in the month of July. That was very strong. So that's, of course, also setting them up for a hawkish tone, and combining that with the other side of the dual mandate, namely inflation, again, being significantly above the 2% where they would like it. It is relatively straightforward for them to continue to be hawkish. But exactly as you're pointing out, David, we have a lot of important data ahead of us. And that's why markets, and that's why the debate continues. Some people in markets have the strong view that, well, rates are going to come down very quickly, very soon. Other people are saying, no, this is more like the 1970s, and this is going to take a longer time. That's why there's such a wide dispersion of views. A more technical way of saying is that the implied vol in rates is very elevated because there is such a wide range of views and wide range of bets being made in markets at the moment about what the scenario is and what road we're going down here at the moment.
Torsten, just put this in a global context, if you would, because we have a Chinese economy that's not growing as fast as they thought it was going to grow, a European economy that certainly is challenged at this point, may well be headed toward a recession, depending on what happens with energy over there, UK economy that admits it's heading to a recession. Does that actually, in an ironic way, potentially help the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, so of course the backdrop for, just think about the latest employment report at more than 500,000 jobs created. The backdrop of slowing global growth, and obviously China is slowing for a number of different reasons, of course, that have to do with the property sector, but also has to do with zero COVID policy. So once the zero COVID policy is lifted, or at least some of the restrictions are lifted, we should expect some rebound in the Chinese economy. The situation in Europe is much more serious because there, of course, as you have covered so well, the energy crisis continues to weigh on the outlook, and there could be a risk of a recession sooner rather than later. So the broader backdrop of slowing growth globally, to your question, is certainly helpful for slowing down the U.S. economy. So we'll see what the next employment report shows. We'll see what the next inflation print shows, and that will then be helping the Fed making the decision for whether it needs to go 50 or 75 at the meeting on the 21st of September.
Torsten, very much appreciate you joining us today. That's Torsten Slok of Apollo. Coming up, a second congressional delegation has now returned from Taiwan, and we're going to talk with one of those on that trip, Democratic Congressman Don Beyer of Virginia. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We have some sad news to report now. Julian Robertson, the founder of Tiger Management, has passed away at the age of 90. He was a legendary investor and, of course, was one of the real pioneers in hedge funds and spun off something like 50 different Tiger Cubs, as they were called, in specific funds of people who had worked with him. To bring us more now, we welcome Sonali Basak. So, Sonali, I knew him pretty well. I'm sure you knew him. He was a wonderful man, but give us a sense of how important he was for the investment community.
He was certainly a titan of Wall Street, David. You are talking about somebody, according to LCH Investments, who had 200 or so investment firms link back to Tiger in some way. He was also a philanthropist, helping low-income New Yorkers from very early on in his tenure as a hedge fund manager, and also signing the Given Pledge. But again, he was known for training generations of fund managers, including Chase Coleman of Tiger Global, Lee Ainsley of Maverick, Andreas Halverson of Vikings, Stephen Mandel of Lone Pine, Philippe Lafont of Coatue. The list goes on, and he remained very close to them. So this is a man who was very close to many people on Wall Street up until now. He died at his home in Manhattan from cardiac complications, according to a longtime spokesman for him, as reported by Bloomberg News and Bloomberg's Kathy Burton, who reported on him for a very long time. This was a man who was very near and dear to many people on Wall Street, from his time at Kidder Peabody to his start of Tiger Management in 1980, after everyone remembers his sabbatical, where he tried to write a book and instead came up with the idea for Tiger Management, then going on to train many generations of investors.
And as you say, a major philanthropist. A lot of us in New York City, we walk past things that he donated for the city. But talk about his role as an early hedge fund person. Maybe not the first, but boy, he was really toward the first of creating hedge funds. Had enormous success, took his investment and turned it many, many times over, and then stumbled a bit.
Yeah, a really, really incredible run he had as a hedge fund manager himself before seeding, as you say, dozens of funds. At Tiger, between 2000 and 1980, when he started the fund, the average annualized returns net of fees were 25%. And remember, he was striking gains north of 30% at the peak until around 1998. He really missed a lot of the issues that a lot of people had gotten into in the height of the tech bubble here. He had even made some really incredible macro trades at that time before stumbling a bit on some of the macro bets that he had made. So to your point here, his focus here on value investing, stock picking, risk management, remember, he wouldn't make any bet too big of a part of his portfolio, was really what he was known for, along with the conviction that he had on the trades that he made.
Yeah, exactly. And as I recall, Sonali, correct me if I'm wrong, he's one of the people who saw the tech bubble coming.
Yes, that's exactly one of the things he's known for. And it was a painful time, too. As it was coming up, it was something that he lagged from, but it was something he was ultimately very right about, and therefore had the last word on. And remember, a lot of the investors that are now taken away from Tiger Management and now are Tiger Cubs, they also are known as some of the most historic tech investors in the world. You know, in reading a little bit about the process of being even an analyst at Tiger Management, they had to answer 450 questions just to get the job and take a Rorschach test. So he had this laser-sharp way of training his staff as well as forming his own wagers here. And again, to your point here, really understanding technology and avoiding a lot of the pitfalls that a lot of investors got burned from in that era.
Talk about some of his philanthropy and some of the things he did. I know, for example, he has a plaza at Lincoln Center named for his late wife, who passed away, sadly, and he was devoted to.
Yeah, I mean, his philanthropy is also what he was very well known for. And he was known also, I want to talk about the Tiger Foundation, because that was incepted in 1989. So again, within 9 years of forming Tiger Management here. And to your point here, this was something that had millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in grants to schools, low-income New Yorkers, training programs, childhood education is something that he focused on very, very strongly here. So again, this is definitely one of the most legendary investors, but also on Wall Street, one of the most legendary philanthropists as well.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us to reminisce about Julian Robertson. That's Sonali Basak. And once again, Julian Robertson, legendary investor, is dead at the age of 90. In the meantime, we want to turn back to Washington if we could. I'm sorry, we're going to go to break. Okay, so let's go to break now. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, Taiwan has been very much in the news pretty much all summer long, with the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, going to visit there, causing some controversy. And then a second congressional delegation went over more recently. We welcome now one of the people who was on that second delegation. He's Democratic Congressman from Virginia, Don Beyer. He's also chair of the Joint Economic Committee. So, Congressman, thank you so much, and thanks for your patience as we broke that sad news about Julian Robertson. So give us a sense of your trip. And I guess, as important as anything else, why did you go?
Yeah, we had set the trip up before Nancy Pelosi's trip was announced, and certainly before she had gone. But we felt it was really important to reinforce the message that despite America's, or maybe because of America's one China policy, that we nevertheless wanted to maintain the status quo in Taiwan and deter, if possible, any kind of forceful intervention that the PRC would have with Taiwan.
And so what did you do while you were over there? With whom did you speak, and what did you accomplish, do you think, looking back on it?
Well, we met with the president, President Tsai, for a half an hour or so. Good conversation. We had a fascinating meeting with 10 or 11 members of the Taiwanese parliament. And I think they must have represented 6 or 7 different parties, including the party just out of power, the party in power. And so there's a range of opinions on strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity and the like. But the biggest impression I got was their gratitude that the American people and the American political leadership was behind their resistance to being simply absorbed into the PRC. You know, they said, I know this sounds subtle, but they wanted to differentiate between the one China principle of the PRC and the one China policy of the United States, which is recognizing that in historical terms, it is one China, but 2 very different governments, 2 different systems, one democracy, one autocracy, one freedom of assembly and speech and capitalism, the other very repressive. We were there to support the good parts of that.
So to talk about specifically what that might look like, let's talk about the negotiations, the discussions, I guess formal discussions now ongoing about a trade arrangement, sort of, I guess, along the lines of the Indo-Pacific economic framework, although not part of that specific proposal from the United States. Where do we stand with that, and what will that accomplish if it is completed?
Well, David, I'm still in the category that thinks that our withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a serious strategic mistake. You know, when the Obama administration was pushing TPP, their idea was that we needed to write the rules of the road for trade in the generation to come. We, not just the United States, but democracies throughout the world, rather than letting China, the People's Republic of China, write them for us. And I think that's what President Biden's trying to do with the Indo-Pacific Trade Framework. And because we can't formally include the people of Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, these as part of that Indo-Pacific, the specific conversations between U.S. Trade Rep Catherine Tai and Taiwan on our trade stuff, I think it's really important to make them feel part of it. And hey, they're our 8th largest trading partner and our largest supplier of chips. We need them.
They're our 8th largest trading partner, but we don't necessarily recognize them as a separate country, right? That is the one China, 2 systems rule. So how does that work? Do you enter a trade agreement with a part of China?
Well, we try to be very careful about how we refer to the people of Taiwan, the Taiwanese island. And I think we'll have that same level of care. That's not government to government, but the United States to the people of Taiwan in this kind of trade arrangement. Clearly, we work on an economic basis, with all the flows back and forth. By the way, we like to brag that Taiwan is our 8th largest trading partner, but their largest trading partner by far is the PRC. And so they have to build on that relationship, too, which is just across the Taiwan Strait.
Bringing us a little closer to home, at least your home, let's talk about cars, because the semiconductors are terribly important to the manufacture of cars. You've had a passing acquaintance with cars in your prior life as a successful businessman, having built it up. Where are we right now with semiconductors coming out of Taiwan?
It's getting better. The inventories are starting to build, but we're still in a relative shortage. Depending on the vehicle, you can still wait 2, 3, 4 months. And David, I think one of the most fascinating statistics came from Kelley Blue Book that last year, something like 82% of the new cars sold were sold at sticker price or more. I can tell you after 46 years in the business, that was pretty rare for those first 45 years. And, and the lots are still largely empty. I'm fascinated driving by, you see a handful of cars as opposed to things, spilling over onto the curb in the grass.
So expand this out to the economy more generally. As I say, you're chair of the Joint Economic Committee. We now have, as you know, the symposium going on in Jackson Hole with Chair Jay Powell about to speak on Friday. Where are we from your point of view on the economy, and what do we need out of the Fed right now?
Well, David, as you know, most economists know, it's this very strange economy that we're in right now. Very strong labor market, 528,000 new jobs, but housing is plummeting. And it's good news on the gas prices, which are down, I think, 30-some days in a row right now. And the other good news is it turns out that the money they're saving on gasoline, they're spending as consumers. I'm optimistic about a very strong third quarter. I saw a projection as high as 5% last night, even though Bloomberg is still saying 1.5% for the third quarter. I don't know what the Fed will do. My hope is that they'll be more like 50 points rather than 75, but they seem very determined to get the inflation down to their 2% goal. That may mean 75 points in Jackson Hole.
Are you more worried right now about a slowdown economically or about inflation?
Oh, much more about a slowdown. And not because of the United States, but as one of your previous guests said, what's happening in China, there's the first time since 1964 that we are growing faster than they are. Back when they were growing 9.5%, 10%, 11% a year, now I heard their second quarter was 0.4%. That does affect the rest of the world. And of course, the energy crisis in Europe, which is not yet overcome. We're part of a global economy, and we're going to have to live with that.
So, Congressman, finally, let's talk a bit about politics. You say that you think there'll be a resurgence in the third quarter. Is that going to be soon enough for the midterm elections?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, not just the resurgence, but the price of gas falling, inflation falling overall. The new numbers come out this week. I think we'll be pleased that we saw the peak already. At least I'm afraid so. But then the biggest thing, David, is we passed the CHIPS and Science Act. We just passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest climate change bill in our history. I think we're showing that we can govern in a constructive way, and that's going to be good for Joe Biden and good for Democrats in November.
Well, you certainly got a lot of legislation through. I'm not sure everyone would have expected that, given the narrow majority in the House. Thank you so much. It's always a treat to have you back, and welcome back from Taiwan, by the way. That's Democratic Congressman from Virginia. He's Mr. Don Beyer. Coming up, oil and gas are buffeted by geopolitical concerns once again. We talk with energy expert Sara Vakhshouri of SVB Strategies about exactly what's going on, what we should expect next for oil and for gas. Somewhat different questions. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. And for that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. Western leaders today warned Russia against annexing other parts of Ukrainian territory after Crimea, amid rumors that Russia is planning to do so in various occupied areas. The leaders sent video addresses to the Crimea Platform Conference in Kyiv, which was attended in person by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Russia stole a part of life, even from those in Crimea who were lucky enough not to become a victim of repression. It was impossible to imagine, but the occupation turned the Crimea, and that was a paradise for all of us. It turned this paradise into the depressed and dependent region.
U.S. officials are warning that Russia is preparing to launch intensified strikes against Ukrainian government facilities in coming days. The U.S. says that a nuclear deal with Iran is getting closer, but that gaps still remain. A State Department spokesman says Iran has appeared to drop some of its, quote, non-starter demands. The Biden administration continues to review the EU's latest proposal to revive the agreement that curbs Iran's nuclear program. Life expectancy in New York plummeted by 3 years in 2020. The CDC says that was the biggest decline among all states in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. Residents of New York are expected to live to just under 78, the 15th highest life expectancy in the country. Overall, U.S. life expectancy plunged by 1.8 years in 2020, the biggest drop since World War II. The University of Texas's endowment is positioned to overtake Harvard's as the richest in the U.S. higher education, but it has nothing to do with investing or fundraising. Every day, the Texas college system makes about $6 million off a chunk of land it manages in the largest oil field in the country. The land is leased to drillers such as ConocoPhillips and Continental Resources. As we have mentioned, Julian Robertson has died at the age of 90. The billionaire Tiger Management founder became one of his generation's most successful hedge fund managers. He was a mentor to a wave of investors known as Tiger Cubs. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, energy, whether it's oil or natural gas, has been in the headlines today, as it's been pretty much every day this entire summer. To bring us up to speed on where we are on oil and on natural gas, we welcome now Sara Vakhshouri. She's founder and president of SVB Strategies. So thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with oil. A report on the Bloomberg today that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's energy minister now says maybe OPEC Plus may have to do something to curtail some supplies because there's too much volatility. What do you make of that?
That's a good way to start the discussion. The volatility in the market is very rapid and very huge. So what Prince Abdulaziz discussed yesterday in media is that there has been a disconnect between the futures market and the current present market. Basically, the paper and the physical market, they're going to a very different routes. The paper market is so much impacted by different sentiments in the market because we have so many uncertainty in the market.
Fascinating. When would OPEC Plus move if it did in fact move?
Well, on the supply side, when we are talking about oil, well, the uncertainties on the supply side, obviously now we are dealing with Iran, the nuclear deal. The market doesn't know when and how much of Iranian oil is coming to the market. So if there is a deal tomorrow, are we going to have those 70 to 100 million barrels of Iranian liquids on the water immediately be in the market? Their export could add another million barrels, at least in the market, million barrels per day. So there's a lot of uncertainty of how and when, how much and when Iranian oil will come to the market. Definitely, if that causes a price reduction further than what it is now, the OPEC will react and cut back more production. On the demand side, however, we also have uncertainty. No one is really sure when Chinese economy is going to recover to really pre-COVID, if next year we're going to have economic slowdown at a global scale. So there are uncertainties on also demand recovery, where the demand is going. And all of this is really making the market to react in the way it's doing today.
So you took us exactly to a question I had about Iran. I mean, today oil is up. I'm looking at my Bloomberg right now, and I think that's probably because of what we heard from Saudi Arabia. But yesterday it was down because of thoughts that maybe we're getting closer to a deal with Iran. If in fact there were a deal, how long would it be before that oil actually hit the marketplace?
So if there is a deal, obviously we have to see the details of that. It seems, and the market expects, that if there is a deal, there is going to be a gradual increase of Iranian oil. But something that we have to consider is that Iran has already about what has been estimated between 75 to 100 million barrels of liquid. Not all of it is crude oil. Plenty of that is condensate, but that's basically ready on floating storages to be released or being exported to different destinations. Also, the question is that if there is going to be waivers given by U.S. government, would that be only for European markets, European importers of oil going to benefit from this deal? Or again, China and India could import that oil, because now under this situation, they're importing a lot of U.S. oil, which is a very long distance to go there.
Let's turn to natural gas now, if we could. It's not just Iran, it's not just Saudi Arabia, it's also Russia who has something to say about energy these days. And we heard actually from Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, just overnight talking about the investments that they're trying to make in Europe. This is part of what he had to say.
We are working hard to become independent of this gas supply, and we are doing a lot of investments to make it happen, and we are doing it as fast as ever possible. Never such an infrastructure has been built in Germany in that a short time.
So, Sarah, they're working very, very hard, no question about it, investing a lot of money. Will it be enough to avoid perhaps a recession in Germany if, in fact, Russia cuts out the national gas?
All the investment is going to take time, at least a few years. Yes, Germany has reached out to different alternative sources. They have even had discussions with Canadian, which is interesting because now we are dealing in the past few years of the North America, U.S., Canada energy trade ties have been weakening. So now we see that Canada and Germany are looking in further energy trade ties. But all of this is not going to be ready for this winter. So this winter is going to be unfortunately dark and cold, because if Russia decides to reduce its gas exports, or there is additional sanctions or retaliations from Russian side, there is not a quick fix for natural gas. Yes, most of the natural gas power plants are switching to oil and liquid, but that means that we need a lot more oil, and also coal available. But there is all of these investments are not going to be ready in time for this winter in the next couple of months. And if the economies started slowing down for the next early next year, this is something that could happen eventually, unless European countries could convince countries like Norway to give discounts. But that's, again, these are just at the political level. It's very hard when it comes to the logistics and implementation phase.
And what does that mean for natural gas prices back here in the United States? Because they seem to be spiking. Is that because of the demand from Europe as they try to build up their stockpiles?
Yes, and also we are hitting the colder season. So we have like maybe a month and a half of warmer season, and obviously the demand for natural gas for heating, also electricity, increases. And U.S. is exporting a lot. Still, the prices in U.S. is way lower than prices in Europe and Asia because we are a major natural gas producer. But yes, obviously we have a seasonal demand, and seasonal demand will cause additional increase of the prices, but especially at the time that now we have in regions like Europe or Asia that there is a huge need for natural gas. But also something that we have to consider is that natural gas is also feedstock for petrochemicals and fertilizers. So it's not just in the electricity and heating, but also its impact on the food prices.
Sarah, this has been very helpful. Really appreciate you spending time with us today. That's Sara Vakhshouri of SVB International. Coming up, the labor market remains tight and inflation high. What does that mean for wages? We ask Alexander Colvin. He's Dean of Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, despite all the contradictory information about the economy, it appears at least the labor market remains pretty robust, at least according to the last jobs report. At the same time, wages are going up, although perhaps not as fast as inflation is going up, all of which really puts some pressure on workers and also on the whole labor management relationship in negotiating wages. To take us through that, we welcome now Alexander Colvin. He's Dean of Cornell's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. So, Dean, thank you so much for being with us. As I say, we all know about inflation. We all know about real wages versus nominal wages. But tell us what you're seeing, the dynamics in the workplace.
I think the dynamics are really coming from a couple of things. One is that we have this genuinely tight labor market. We've got low unemployment. We have lots of jobs out there for people who want jobs. People have alternatives, so they feel they have some power. But the other side is a push. They see the high inflation. coming from these high commodity prices, and they feel the need to push the wages up to keep up, essentially. So we've got really a perfect combination of factors where we're going to expect to see a real push for higher wages.
And I wonder in what form that might take. We're seeing strikes over in the United Kingdom, a very major port. A lot of places are going on strike. I'm not sure we've seen that much of that here, but are we seeing more union organizing?
We are seeing that strike pressure in Britain. There's some hints in the United States too, discussions around the rail unions and the possibility of a strike. So we certainly are seeing that what's happened in the UK could spread to our labor market. I do think it spreads beyond that, though, as well, that we see non-union workers as well pushing for higher wages. So I think these are interconnected things going on in the economy right now.
So it's all understandable the way you lay it out. At the same time, the one thing I think every economist tells us we want to avoid is the so-called wage price spiral, which we did have back in the 70s you referred to. How do we accommodate the workers, give them what they need and deserve, and at the same time avoid a wage price spiral?
Yeah, I think that is something to really think about what was different in the 1970s. There were a lot of what we call the COLA clauses, the cost of living adjustment clauses, that automatically adjusted to inflation. And those were really built into a lot of collective agreements. We just don't see that today. If you look at collective agreements today, you don't see a whole lot of COLA clauses. If we have the one-time wage increases that keep the workers up with inflation, I don't think we should fear that the same way we would a built-in COLA clause type push of wages. So yeah, we're seeing pressure from workers, but I don't think it's the same as happened back in the 70s.
As you suggest, those cost of living adjustments, as I recall, came out of collective bargaining agreements. The percentage of workers who were represented by a union back then, particularly in the private sector, was significantly higher than it was today. Is that not right? Is that turning around?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The percentage was much higher. We had, over 20% of workers represented in America by unions. Today, it's below 11% and down to around 6% of the private sector. So unions are much weaker. We have seen an uptick in organizing, though, just the last year or so. Starbucks is one of the most prominent examples of that, where you've seen a number of stores across the country unionizing. Amazon, we saw the facility in New York City unionized. So there does seem to be a new energy of organizing going on this year.
At the same time, we have a president in Joe Biden who has been unabashed in his support for organized labor. Has that made a difference yet?
I think it makes a difference symbolically. I do think people look to the president, ask the national leader to set a tone, and Biden has clearly set that tone. He's got a Secretary of Labor who's a former union leader, and I think he's been clear that he is supportive of organized labor. So I think that does change the mood. We're seeing a lot more support for unions amongst younger workers. I think they're picking up on that shift in the political vibe, a more positive attitude towards unions.
So what's the best path forward from your point of view? Because you see this from both sides and you deal with actual labor disputes. What's the best path forward, as I say, to sort of accommodate the workers who have very reasonable demands because they're seeing the price at the pump, price of the supermarket go up all the time. They need more money to cover it. At the same time, we don't want this to get out of control.
Yeah, I think our traditional tool of collective bargaining is something that can deal with this. Negotiation, sitting down at the table, management and labor across from each other, and having reasonable discussions about what the wages, the hours, the terms and conditions of employment are. It's an old solution, but I think it's one that works. It can adjust to the current economic situations, to the need of the business, and the need of the workers to a decent wage. So sit down at the negotiating table and hammer out an agreement. That's the best way to do it.
At the same time, the nature of work has changed for an awful lot of Americans. I mean, a gig economy is what a lot of people call it. But we don't have the situation where you go to work for a company, an employer, and you're there for 30 or 40 years, which was, I think, more consistent with collective bargaining, was it not?
It was, but I think there's ways of doing it that can actually work more effectively in this kind of new economy. It's interesting, some of the models we see in industries like entertainment, where people go from one movie to another or one TV show to another, those kind of models could be adapted to some of our new economy, gig economy type settings. There's tools we have that could be used effectively in the new setting as well. So I don't think we want to throw out that basic idea of figuring out a structure where people can sit down and negotiate and come to reasonable deals that fit the circumstances of this new economy.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. This was very helpful. That's Dean Alexander Colvin of Cornell. Coming up, we take a look at today's New York primaries with our New York bureau chief, Shelley Banjo. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Westin. Well, it's getting toward the end of August. A lot of people are at the beach, on vacation somewhere else. But what is New York doing? It's holding primary elections. To take us through that, we welcome now Bloomberg New York bureau chief. She's Shelley Banjo. So before we get to the races, is anybody going to vote?
Well, that's the question. How many people are still around the city, or how many people are going to vote absentee? We had pretty meager totals in early voting. There was only about 70,000 people that showed up, which is about 60% less than who showed up for early voting during the mayor's race last year.
So if you look around the state, all these congressional primaries, which is the most important, do you think?
I think the most consequential one is the race between Carolyn Maloney and Gerald Nadler, because they've both been serving for 30 years. They're both, long time on members of the House on important committees. And so one of them is going to go, or both of them could go. But we know that by the end of this week, one of them will no longer, hold that seat.
It's a lot of seniority going up in smoke, as it were, as effectively. What's the most interesting one?
So one of the most interesting ones, I think, is this New York 10 district, which is Lower Manhattan and the, what affectionately is called Brownstone, Brooklyn. It is one of the most diverse districts in New York, probably one of the most progressive corners in America, and there's about a dozen people running. The limited polling that has been conducted shows that Dan Goldman, who is one of the heirs to the Levi Strauss jeans empire, is leading the race, but there's so many people in that race that it really will probably come down to hundreds of votes.
But there's one fewer, right? Isn't this one where former Mayor Bill de Blasio put his hat in the ring for a minute or two?
That's right. De Blasio tried to run and said, you know what, this is too crowded and I'm polling too low and I'm not raising enough money, so I'm going to get my skedaddle out of here.
So what do we know about Dan Goldman, other than the fact that he was involved in the impeachment of Donald Trump? That's what you see from all the ads we see all the time on TV here in New York.
That's right. So he has been in New York for a long time. He worked in SDNY. He was a lawyer. He went up to be a lawyer on the first Trump impeachment hearing, and he's really traded on that during his campaign. He's talked a lot about democracy and upholding democracy, but he's also paid for his whole run. He did raise money, but then about $1 million of it, he said, I'm sick of fundraising. I'm just going to use my own money to buy this race, which has created criticism that he's trying to buy the race.
It also explains why I see so many ads on TV when I watch the local news, right? And who are the other significant players in that race, do you think?
So one interesting one is Julian Robertson, who's a Taiwanese American, who's represented Lower Manhattan, Chinatown for the state Senate. Carolina Rivera, she is a city council member there, and then Mondaire Jones, who moved from Rockland County after being booted there to avoid kind of an inter-party race with Sean Patrick Maloney over to the 10th Congressional District. And so it's a crowded race with a lot of people that people know. And so that's kind of the question, is all these people kind of have their own little bases of support. So how many of them are going to actually get those people to turn out in the middle of August and go vote? We have a viewer actually writing an excellent question I should have thought to ask, which is, okay, if nobody gets 50%, is there a runoff, or is it just plurality? For the primaries itself, it's just plurality. So we had this, ranked voting during the mayor's race last year, which was extremely confusing, but it ended, delaying a lot of the results. We don't have that in this scenario. One last one, just because it gets so much attention. Mr. Palladino, up toward Buffalo. Right. And so this is, one of the most Republican, if not the most Republican corners of New York. Buffalo, businessman Carl Palladino. He has it's been described as, Trumpy versus Trumpier between the two people. He's running against the state chairman of the Republican Party, Nick Langworthy. And, a lot of folks are, somewhat worried by a lot of the racist comments that Palladino has has made, but he has been endorsed by Elise Stefanik. Trump has not actually endorsed either of them, but they both have close ties to him.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. Really great to have you here. That's Bloomberg New York Bureau Chief Shelley Banjo. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and also online. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.